Hello, Buzzkillers. It's me. It's the old professor here. And perhaps there's nothing quite so old as the myth of Dracula, but something that is old but sticks with us and is constantly renewed and shows up in fiction and all that sort of stuff over and over and over again. And very fortunately for me, and even more fortunately for you, we have Dr. Gemma Masson on the line from Birmingham in the UK, who's an expert on all of this, Dracula studies especially, to talk to us about Dracula and Vlad the Impaler and that whole area and of world history and why it is so enduringly popular. Dr. Mason, thanks so much for coming on the show.
My absolute pleasure.
When you and I met over Twitter, we started talking about this. I couldn't stop laughing and getting excited about it because it's going to be so fun. But first of all, we need to establish some things. Maybe the first thing is, who is the we should start with the Dracula of Bram Stoker, the Dracula of fiction, the Dracula that everybody sort of knows. Who was he? How did that happen?
He was a creator of Irish writer Bram Stoker. We all know Bram Stoker's Dracula, from which was based sort of your Bela Lugosi, your Christopher Lee, those classic movie vampires. Mm-hmm. Bram Stoker, in writing his vampire story and the connection to Whitby, where a great deal of the plot takes place, I believe best intelligence I have on this is from the work of the late great Professor Elizabeth Miller, who we have very tragically lost, who's like the mother of Dracula studies. She did a lot of work picking the myth around not just the contents of the book, but the creation of the story. Because Stoker was working on a vampire novel when I believe he went on holiday to Whitby. And
by the way, let's inform the Buzzkillers where Whitby is, because most of our listeners are American or other countries. Okay. They won't know.
Whitby is on the coast in the United Kingdom. It is where in Bram Stoker's Dracula, he shipwrecks when he comes ashore, coming over to England from Romania. He comes by sea, and it is a huge center for sort of the goth subculture and Dracula studies, and they have huge events throughout the year at Whitby. It is a central place in the novel, and it is a real place you can go to and soak up some of the culture and get the traditional British seaside weather of rain and seagulls trying to steal your chips. Basically,
but everything. It is a resort too.
It is a Victorian seaside town. It's in Yorkshire. It's in the north of England. Looks out over the North Sea, and it was actually the Whitby Abbey that is this old Gothic building that really fed into a lot of Bram Stoker's imagination. So yeah, there are plenty of tourist attractions, not just connected to Dracula, but also the historical Cat and Cook. There's a lot of things there. If you're a Dracula fan, a history fan, and you're coming over to the UK, Whitby is worth looking at.
And let's also remind the Buzzkillers who Bram Stoker was, because they'll know the name. It's now that name is sort of emblazoned in the popular consciousness, but they don't really know about him.
Bram Stoker, Abraham Stoker, Irish author, born in the middle of the 19th century in Ireland. He was a playwright. He was involved in the theatre in London as well. He is best known for Dracula, but he has written other Gothic works, Lair of the White Worm, that kind of thing. During his lifetime, who's probably best known is the personal assistant of the actor Sir Henry Irving, and he was the business manager of the West End Lyceum Theatre. So he became famous for his books posthumously, as it were.
And what's the basic plot of the novel?
Basic plot of the novel is the style of the novel is very interesting because it is a sequence of letters and diaries that are just placed in order to form the chronology of the story. And I think that is a very clever literary technique. We begin with young solicitor Jonathan Harker, who is being sent out to Eastern Europe to look after one of his firm's clients, the mysterious Count Dracula. He's trying to buy property in England, and his predecessor on this excursion, Mr. Renfield, has become ill, so he's unable to do it. Jonathan goes out there, and I don't know if I'm spoilerizing at this point because it's a classic and everyone should see it.
But don't worry about that.
He experiences, there are vampire brides. There is, the Count's being a bit, Yeah, all those little tropes of like Dracula going, "I do not drink wine," or all those little things that make sense of being a joke afterwards. And back home, Jonathan's fiancée, Mina, is spending time with her friend Lucy Westenra. So Mina Harker, Lucy Westenra, who are the main ladies of the novel. Lucy's desperately trying to decide between three different romantic suitors, and her friend's there trying to help her. So there's this whole section there. And one of those suitors is a Dr. Jack Seward, who runs a mental asylum in which Mr. Renfield, who was Jonathan Stoker's predecessor, is currently being treated. So we get a little insight into Renfield and what happened to him. And he's very much obsessed with, yeah, he keeps saying, this is where we get the phrase, the blood is the life. He keeps saying this to Dr. Seward, and he talks about his master, and his master is coming. And this is where we get the idea of the vampire's thrall, which actually becomes quite popular in vampire mythology thereafter.
What is that, the vampire's thrall?
The idea of a mortal that is under the control of the vampire, that serves the vampire, that can go out during the day to do their bidding,
Okay.
carry out their errands, and essentially do the things that the vampire themselves can't. And you see this in Renfield because he feeds the flies to the spiders. He eats the spiders because every life he consumes gives life to him. And it sounds like this insane rambling until it gets sort of filled in with the awareness of the vampirism that is happening. So Jonathan gets stranded out in Eastern Europe. Dracula arrives in England, where he seduces Lucy and attempts to move on Mina. There's a lot of, that's the main relationship there. Lucy eventually dies, and we have the character Abraham Van Helsing, who Jack Seward has brought in, said he's a specialist on obscure blood diseases. Maybe he can help Lucy. Then, of course, Lucy passes. And Dr. Van Helsing, I've seen this before. There's a vampire here. We have to do something about that. So you get this little band forming with Professor Van Helsing in the lead of Lucy's three suitors and Mina, and Jonathan when he eventually escapes and sort of makes his way back and is married to Mina. And there on out, you have very much this group going after the vampire and being like, we can't let him spread, we can't let him kill. He's after Mina, he's doing all kinds of things. And then there's this big confrontation at the end where they kill Dracula. Now there have been canonical sequels which are acknowledged by the Stoker estate, but I'm not going to get into those too much, a little bit, because that's, the whole world has been expanded quite recently. Like the canonical world of Dracula has been expanded quite a lot.
So again, when is the book actually published?
It is the late 1890s, I believe 1897. Okay. So it is within Stoker's lifetime, because Stoker didn't die until 1912.
But it doesn't become popular until after his death.
It's not a household name. Certainly everyone's read Dracula or everyone knows the story. It really doesn't become that popular until more into the 20th century. And I think there was a big interest in the supernatural happening around the late 19th century, but it's more the era of spiritualism and mediums. So, Conan Doyle was involved in that. Seances. So like that was very much in vogue paranormal thing. No one was really thinking about vampires and werewolves. I think they were seen as something quite provincial and rural, something that happens out in the wilds of Europe and the Black Forest, and not in our nice little urban cities. There was vampire literature that has existed, stories of vampires from way back into all of world mythologies, from John Polidori's Vampire, which did come before Bram Stoker and again isn't as well known, Le Fanu's Carmilla. They were viewed as quite niche. I don't think these dark gothic subjects really became very mainstream until the 20th century.
But the Dracula story, or at least the Bram Stoker Dracula story, is picked up by the early film industry. So it must have been sufficiently popular that they decided to jump on that. First of all, in silent films, and then later in if you will, what I call Hollywood and Pinewood, two towers of the great film industry.
Obviously the film industry would have been after Bram Stoker's time. I think it might have been a case of being able to get the rights to do it, because you have your Bela Lugosi Dracula, which is a role he revisits several times over the course of his career. But you also get Nosferatu, which is a very different genre of vampire to Dracula. Count Olaf is more of the traditional, the Nosferatu vampire, the way they look. They're the shroud chewers, they're the walking, decomposing corpses that actually are scary to look at. When you look at Stoker's Dracula, he's this very urbane, he's aristocratic, he's attractive, he's charismatic, he's a monster underneath, but he looks normal, and that almost makes him more frightening as he's an unknown quantity, whereas
Right.
you wouldn't expect it to look at him.
By the way, before we get too far into what happens to the popular concepts of Dracula, you mentioned at the beginning, I'm sorry to go back, Buzzkillers, and to go back to this point. The novel is told in, as you say, a series of diary reports, newspaper clippings, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Was that in one of Stoker's innovations, or was that a fairly common literary style at the time? This is 40 years, 40 years after Dickens, so it would seem really quite a shock to be doing something that, I don't know, I don't want to say postmodern because it's not postmodern, but you know what I mean. It's definitely a different type of narrative.
I think at the time, storytelling, you very often had this framing narrative, this story within a story aspect. If you look at Conan Doyle's books, it is Dr. Watson writing his accounts after the fact, reminiscing. Or if you look at a lot of the popular sort of Victorian ghost stories, it's very often we were gathered around the fire and then someone came and told this story, and then it goes into the ghost story. So I think that would be something that was quite common. Now, using it on the scale that Stoker did, maybe he was trying something a bit different. But also, I think if you think about how novels would be serialized, maybe he had that hope while he was creating it, that it would be serialized, so it would make sense to write a letter, to help him compartmentalize. That's just my hypothesis. I don't know what's going on in Stoker's brain when he's writing it, but in an era when novels were serialized in sort of literary magazines and things, that might have been what he was aiming for.
Well, obviously, the early film industry and then the Hollywood Pinewood film industry isn't going to take it to that degree. But it's interesting what you say about how Dracula and vampires and different types of vampires sort of get merged into one. And the distinctions of Stoker's Dracula that make him so different don't really show up so much in the movies. He just becomes a horror figure.
Vampires become this huge cultural zeitgeist. Everyone knows a vampire. There are millions of vampire franchises out there that have been for a very long time. Many authors put their own spins on it. I think for a lot of people in the public consciousness, Dracula is the OG.
Oh, well, wait a minute. Dracula is now we have to remember we're from two different generations. What does OG mean?
Dracula means he's the original. He's the the kind of like the first when it starts. Dracula, again, is a figure who has been, it's not just the vampire that's been reimagined for each generation and each age. Dracula himself that's been retold several times, from Bela Lugosi through Christopher Lee to Bram Stoker's Dracula with Gary Oldman to our more modern televised and movie versions, and films like Dracula Untold, which combines Vlad the Impaler's history with the Dracula vampire legend. So that's becoming more entangled as well. So I think there really is so much potential when it comes to, it's not just, I'm just going to tell a Dracula story. There is no one way to tell a Dracula story anymore. And I think that's kind of part of the fun of it, because everyone has their own spin.
Yeah, well, and I guess the idea of a monster who literally draws the life out of someone by sucking blood or whatever it happens to be for a vampire is very fascinating to people. It's not just a horror figure or monster who goes around with an axe chopping people's heads off. It's more vampiric. It's actually courting the person, stalking the person, finding them, and then drawing life out of them. So there's a lot more, I don't know, stuff to draw on for different movies and different plots and different narratives and different stories. I wonder if anyone's made video games of this.
Oh God, yes. I mean, I've played a couple of. I'm not a big gamer, but there are some Dracula point and click games, because that's about my level.
Right.
Yeah, that's what you want. No, that's what my gamer husband calls them, point and click. That is about my level. I can't with the big kind of controllers, and I can't. That's not my skill set at all.
No, but I'm thinking about the fangs, pointing and clicking, but also fangs in the throat.
It will be. Someone needs to make a vampire game where that's how it works. Unfortunately, I haven't seen that, but yeah, there are vampires are big in computer games. Vampire the Masquerade, which was this live action role playing game, that's a computer game now as well. People who do live action role play around the 80s and particularly the 90s, Vampire the Masquerade was a big thing, and it was the outsiders, the creative kids, the theater kids, those
Mm,
the literature people, like those people who are into it. And I mean, there's board games of it. There was a TV series. There's computer games, and you have all the different vampire clans that have all their different attributes. So this is what I mean when I talk about the vampire mythology just being so huge. And when you talk about a creature that literally draws the life out of you, it is not just by blood. We have some schools of thought that give us three different classifications of vampire, and the blood drinkers are just the one type.
mm,
The second type is the incubus or the succubus, the idea that your life force is drained through sexual intercourse. So you might know them more commonly as demons in folklore. And the third type is the psi vampires or the energy vampires, who literally just, if you've ever been around a person and just time in their company, you come away feeling, oh my goodness, that kind of thing. Like the idea that they feed on, I think it's called pranic energy, like life force, without actually drawing blood or anything like that. So, we do have the three schools of thought, but also the question of blood in vampires as we most commonly know them, it's very sexual. It's very sexually charged. The drawing blood from the neck or the femoral artery in the thigh is what some of the more racy vampire stories do. And there's this representation of blood as symbolic of sexual awakening, like when the young girls that are the most common vampires prey when a girl begins to menstruate. Allegedly, she's reaching sexual maturity. So there is that connection between blood and all of that representation as well. There's a lot of symbolism in blood.
yeah. Well, as you say, that all these things just make it so rich for different types of fictional treatment. Well, Buzzkillers, this is a good time for us to take a little break, and we've dealt with the, if you will, modern Dracula, the Dracula of fiction, the Dracula of Hollywood. And when we get back, we're going to talk about various attempts to try to find the, quote, real Dracula and what aspects of Dracula's studies have to do with earlier history. So back in a moment. Buzzkillers, we are back with Dr. Gemma Masson talking about Dracula and perhaps more importantly and more to the point of the show, Dracula studies. Dr. Masson, before we left, you explained all about the original novel and then how it's been transformed in many, many different ways. But let's go back to some of the, I don't know, historical Draculas or some of the what might have been the inspirations for Dracula, for Stoker. After all, there seems to be this tendency in cultures to take a fictional character, even someone who in theory might be totally fictional, completely made up. I know it might not be the case with Dracula, and then try to find the historical origin. This drives a lot of historians nuts, but it doesn't drive people in Dracula studies nuts because there is such a rich history in the region
Yes.
we're about to talk about. So please start us off with the basics of where in the world this is supposed to have originated and who were supposed to be the originators.
Okay, well, the first thing I'm going to say is how Stoker got hold of the name Dracula. His library records show that he checked out a book on the history of Eastern Europe in which the Dracula family that we're about to discuss was mentioned. And best case scenario, like the best guess we have is he thinks, oh, that name is suitably ominous. It's got quite a dark history to it. I can use that for the vampire novel I'm writing, because up until then we see from his notebooks he was going to call his protagonist just Count Vampire with the YRE. He just thought the name sounded good. So when it comes to the historical Dracula, Dracula in Romanian, la is the diminutive suffix, so it literally means little dragon or the son of the dragon. In the female, it would be Draculina, to be daughter of the dragon. And it is attributed to a young prince in what is now modern day Romania, what would be then Wallachia or Wallachia, however you wish to pronounce it, who was the second born son of local prince Voivod Vlad Dracula. Now, their family name, they were actually Basarab was the family name. The title Dracul was given to his father because his father was a member of a Christian chivalric order called the Order of the Dragon, which had the goal of keeping the Muslim Turks out of Europe. And because his father was such a prominent figure in this movement, he became known as Vlad Dracula, so his son became Vlad Dracula. I say Vlad is the second born. He had an older brother, Mircea, Marcia, you might see it written as, who died at the same time as their father did, which left Vlad as the eldest son. Now, this is where Vlad comes into what is my actual main playground, which is Ottoman history, because my PhD is in Ottoman
Yeah.
studies.
But by
So
the way, remind the buzzkillers what dates we're talking about here.
we're talking about the 1400s, early
Okay, right. Yeah,
1400s
yeah,
in Europe. So everything is small principalities. You don't really have the nation state yet,
yeah.
like as we know today. The then Ottoman Sultan Murad, he wanted to ensure that this Vlad Dracula would behave and would not make trouble for him. So he essentially took his two younger sons, Vlad and baby brother Radu, to the Ottoman court as a political hostage, where they grew up and were educated and essentially were given the same education as the Sultan's elite soldiers. They learnt warcraft, they learnt politics. They were actually classmates of the young prince who would be the future Mehmed the Conqueror, who would
Yeah.
go on to take Constantinople in 1453. Radu, being the younger boy, he was completely seduced by this life. He became a favorite of Murad, a favorite of Mehmet. He actually converted to Islam and just stayed there and would later become a vassal prince under Ottoman rule. Vlad has a different psychology. He's very loyal to his father, very loyal to his country, very loyal to his faith. He's a scholar. He learns all of the Arabic language. He learns the Quran. He can speak Turkish. He's really quite an intelligent, erudite young man. But I always picture him in his time at the Ottoman court as thinking, know your enemy. I'm going to learn as much as I can about you so I know where to hit you when I get my chance. A lot of the princes under his father's rule were saying, why don't we just collaborate with the Ottomans? We pay them tribute and they'll leave us alone to do our own thing. And through that resistance, Vlad Dracula, the father, and the older brother were both killed. And when that happened, the Sultan presumably believed he had Vlad on his side and said, okay, I'm going to send you back to reclaim your throne and you're going to do it under my patronage. And Vlad essentially sort of went, claimed the throne and said, thanks, but no thanks. Thanks for the army, but I can take it from here, Murad. And literally just set out on his campaign to, no, I'm going to honor my father's memory. We're going to keep Muslims out. We're going to be a Christian country. And he was deposed. He reigned twice. So at a certain point, he was put under house arrest, and then he's brought back out of it by the King of Hungary. And he is given an army and said, okay, go fight the Turks. Oh, by the way, you're going to marry my daughter, who is a Catholic. And Vlad was like, whatever, just give me an army. I want to fight the Turks. This is what I'm doing. I'll marry whoever. I don't care. And it was on one of those campaigns, in fact, that he was killed on the battlefield. As far as we know, because a lot of legends and mythology, and there's a lot of sneaky theorizing in fiction and history and things like that. But no, we're pretty sure he died, unfortunately. As much as I like to entertain some of the conspiracy theories, because just for fun, it doesn't hurt anyone for me to entertain them. He died. He was decapitated on a battlefield, unfortunately. One of the things that is actually beautifully ironic, the fact that Dracula came to be attributed to a vampire, is that he'd been raised in Orthodox Christianity, but obviously he marries this Catholic princess. And the common superstition at the time said if you died excommunicated from the church, you were at risk of returning as a vampire. And of course, the Orthodox Church excommunicated him when he married the Catholic princess. So that's just a little fun tidbit that I always think of. Put that away for your next pub quiz, and then, you never know. You never know.
From what we can tell, Bram Stoker takes Vlad Dracula really for the name and not much more. But as you say, all these conspiracy theories and all these tinfoil hat wearing people, I don't know, they seem to pick up on the nickname Vlad the Impaler. They seem to pick up on Vlad the Little Dragon, all this stuff that then frankly, they invent connections to turn him into this consistent thread throughout history.
The thing is, a lot of stories from history, you can find whatever you want there, because from the 14th century things that are word of mouth. They had their spin doctors. There are all these woodcuts of
Yeah.
Vlad impaling forests of people. And I think at one point I was reading a novel about him, about the historical Vlad, and he says, "You see how many people they say I impaled? I would still be there now, hefting wood. It's not humanly possible." People pick up on little dragon, also sometimes interpreted as little devil or son of the devil, because dragon devil associations in Christianity. The impalement, that was a thing he did, probably not to the extent that people attribute to him, but it was something I believe he ironically learned while a prisoner of the Ottomans. He observed it as a form of torturous
Oh,
execution. It's extremely unpleasant. I'm sure I don't need to describe it. You're placed upright on a pole. It goes right up through either your rear or your genitals, and it goes up and very often like just comes out of the mouth.
and
So
slowly. It's a horrific way to.
very slowly. If by some miracle it doesn't puncture internal organs or something like that, you'll be in a great deal of pain and you'll die of exposure, if nothing else. There are ideas that it is kind of a similar type of death to crucifixion, where
Right, right.
it's exposure and the being hung up and things like that. This is a type of punishment. This dates back to ancient Egypt. They were executing tomb robbers via impalement. This has been around in human society a very long time. You have sometimes it's done as Vlad did it, sometimes it's done with the body sort of lying across the top so it pierces right through perpendicular. A lot of different cultures have done this, so it has been present. So in theory you could have picked it up anywhere, but it did become something that he was known for, this particularly brutal. And it wasn't just something he did to his enemies. He used it. He was an extreme law and order person, and he used it
Mm,
for crimes. If you were, a murderer, a thief, an adulterer, whatever, same punishment for everyone. There are all these theories that we entertain, where one theory said that he had been sexually abused by some of his Ottoman captors, and that's why he got this obsession with the very phallic stake, kind of impaling them as a kind of revenge, that was maybe part of his psychosis or psychology. I don't know. That is a theory I've heard. That is nothing definitively proven. This is why he becomes known as, his Romanian name is Sepesh, which means impaler. And they call him in Turkish Kazikulu Bey, literally the impaler prince. This is how he's known across most of the cultures who've ever touched him. Again, a lot of things are apocryphal. Like there are tales where he would have people impaled and he would have bowls to collect the blood that ran down from them, which he would have brought to him, and he would dip his bread in it or whatever.
right, right,
We
right.
can't prove that, but these are probably things that came after Bram Stoker's vampire Dracula. So we think, well, if the historical Dracula was consuming blood by dipping his bread in, like there's
Yeah.
no hard and fast, reliable primary source evidence, let's say, that confirms that for us. But again, that's part of a lot of the propaganda and spin that was being put around about him, and also just survival of reliable records from the
Yeah.
1400s is just, we don't have that
Yeah.
much to work with.
On the other hand, it does create this field of Dracula study. We
Mm-hmm.
end up, not we, you and people in the field end up studying the people who have made something out of this, and you do wonder, and you do study why they do this. So please give the Buzzkillers some great stories about what it's like to be a scholar of Dracula studies. You must run into the most interesting people in the world.
Oh, Joe, you have no idea. One of my areas of research interest is how history is represented in popular culture, which
Right.
is like novels, movies, and things, which, of course, Dracula is the most prominent
Mm.
example of that. As we said, we have so much material for that. And it was, ironically, a Dracula book that got me into Ottoman studies and that first introduced me to this connection that Dracula had to the Ottoman world. And it remains to date my favorite novel in print, and everyone should read it. The book is called The Historian. It is by Elizabeth
Yes.
Kostova, and I
Yes,
love
yes,
that
yes.
book. I love that book.
Yeah, we're going to put
Um,
it on the Buzzkill bookshelf among with some other Dracula stuff.
I definitely recommend that. The beauty of Dracula studies is that because we have Bram Stoker's literary Dracula and we have the historical Vlad Tepes, we have right away this is such an interdisciplinary field. So we have
Mm.
historians and literature scholars and folklorists who are interested in the vampire myth, and pop culture people who study vampire movies and things like that. So it really is this huge academic melting pot where we can really exchange a lot of ideas, and that is something I find really exciting. Two of the biggest names in scholarly Dracula studies would be, as I said, the late Professor Elizabeth Miller, who was
Mm-hmm.
the founder of so much Dracula work. She's amazing. And she was a literature scholar. She's English literature. And then we have Raymond McNally, who is the original Dracula historian over in the US. Again, another very recent and very tragic loss to the Academy, passed away a few years ago. But one of my favorite things, when I started going through the Journal of Dracula Studies, which is a thing, I found two of the earliest articles that were published, one of them by Professor Miller, and then a response article by McNally, because Professor Miller was very much about we need to unpick and understand what's a literary creation and what's a history. So she wrote this article that was called Filing for Divorce, Count Dracula versus Vlad Tzepes. And oh, McNally's response is better because he wrote a response article. Bear in mind, McNally's the historian. He wrote a response article that said separation granted, divorce denied, annulment unlikely. So when you say, I meet interesting people, you have no idea. These are the kind of people who founded the discipline of
Yeah,
Dracula
yeah,
studies.
yeah.
And I do see Professor McAnally's point where, frustrating as it is to some people and to some particular historical purists, you are not ever going to separate the name Dracula from vampirism.
No,
You
no,
just
no, 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 no.
it's just not going to happen. I don't think that's a bad thing, because I think this prevalence of the vampire Dracula being in front of people encourages people to look further into him and to access the history of the real Dracula behind him. I think that's why Dracula studies has become so big. People get really into the vampire, then they go, oh, this was an actual guy. What was he about?
Yeah.
So I really think that that's a good thing, in my opinion. I have a very dear friend. He is writing a series of novels about the life of Vlad Dracula right now. Victor T. Foyer, his Dracula Chronicles books. We correspond and we talk quite a bit about history and Dracula studies and whatnot. He is a Romanian native. He lives in the US now and he's writing his books. When he encountered the vampire Dracula moving to the US, this is not the Dracula he grew up with. He's
Right,
like, Dracula is one of our great princes. He's a national hero. He's not a vampire. It's interesting for me to have that dialogue with someone who encountered the historical Dracula first.
First, right. Because almost the
Yeah,
rest of us, it's the other way around.
yeah, exactly. For most of the West, for sure. He's very, very good at research and at getting the histories on. I definitely recommend looking at his works. So we have some really fascinating discussions about Dracula and how people interact with Dracula's story. But I think more and more now, popular culture, we are seeing more signs of it's not just in nonfiction, we are seeing more novels about the historical Dracula, not just Victor's books. We've got C.C. Humphreys, Vlad the Last Confession is another one. There's all kinds of things. And in the cinema as well, I think the recent movie Dracula Untold, if you haven't seen it, basically it combines the historical Vlad with the vampire mythology in a way that really whets your appetite for the history of it, I would say. We are seeing more of that. I'm very much in favor of, but for me, taking a step back and looking at it as how history is represented in popular culture, I find it really interesting that the vampire that's that snatch factor for people. But I'm in favor if it gets people interacting with the history. So
Right, right. Well, what I'd be more in favor of actually is if the people who consult you and people in your field, the experts, would actually pay you consulting fees. So I really wish that Hollywood would have you on retainer. I really
yeah,
wish
please,
that.
please. Does anyone want to do anything? Pay me for it, please. I will do it.
Well, but what they do end up doing is just grabbing at any old story they hear and then writing it up as a story. They don't bother consulting the experts, and certainly they don't bother paying the experts.
I do think they could do that. They have the freedom of we're creating fiction. It doesn't matter if we get it wrong. It's just a theory. It's just a story. I would like to see. I'm completely on your side, particularly because it would be It would be good for me and good for business.
Yeah. Well, but the other entity that's not paying you is the Buzzkill Institute. So we're very grateful that you've come on to the show for free and talked about this wonderful subject. I hope that you'll come back on again because, we do full episodes like this one, but we also do Man Crush Mondays, Woman Crush Wednesdays, days, all kinds of things about unknown people who deserve more attention. And there must be a billion in Dracula studies in the chronological and regional period that you study. So
Oh
please,
yeah.
please, please come back on the show.
Yeah, hit me up. Like I say, I'm all things Dracula, folklore, Ottoman history, like all of that. That's my sandpit. That's my playground. It's an absolute pleasure to be somewhere where, as I said, I can talk about Dracula for as long as I want. No one will tell me to shut up and sit down. I think most of my friends and family, bless them, have had their patience worn thin. I found this new article and it's really interesting, and they're going, "Oh, for God's sake, she's doing it again." So,
But now that
but
you're famous on Professor Buzzkill, they'll put up with it. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
absolute pleasure anytime. Thank you for having me.
Buzzkillers, please sleep well tonight with no nightmares, and we'll talk to you next week.